A while back, we did a video talking about the best kinds of card effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! The game has changed a lot since then, so what players would consider the best cards and card effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has changed alongside it. So today, we're going to take another look at the best card effects in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And what they really are. And starting off at number 10, we have cards being unaffected by card effects. Cards with this effect are often referred to as towers after the card Apocryphal Towers, one of the first cards that was meta-defining thanks to this effect. This effect does exactly what it says. It means that any card that would have an effect on the unaffected card simply does nothing. Destruction, negation, banishing, all are completely unaffected against an unaffected monster. A monster being unaffected by card effects is especially brutal in Yu-Gi-Oh! Thanks to the game's battle system. Unlike some other card games, you can't usually attack your opponent directly. Instead, in Yu-Gi-Oh! You have to go through all of their monsters first. If your opponent has a monster that's larger than all of yours, you can't do anything. Normally, you could get around this by simply removing the monsters some other way. But what if that monster is immune to all of your card effects? Well, then you're just kind of out of luck. This emphasis on removing the opponent's monsters as a necessity to end the game has made monster protection premium in Yu-Gi-Oh! Since the beginning. Effects such as targeting protection, destruction protection, or floating have been around for a long time to give monsters some staying power. But all of these have answers. Being unaffected by card effects is the strongest form of protection in Yu-Gi-Oh! With the fewest answers, which means that strategies can often just end on monsters with this effect and have that be a big part of their game plan. Even fairly recent decks such as Purely have used X Purely Noir as their main method of closing games, backed up with a few other powerful card effects. There are degrees to this kind of protection though. X Purely and other, more recent tower style cards like Vanquish Soulseize or Veilus are only immune to your opponent's activated effects, so any effects that don't activate will still affect them. Not to mention that all of these cards are still weak to the all-important Kaiju style of removal, tributing an opponent's monster for cost. As strong as this effect is, it's not something that gets printed on cards as often as other effects, so its actual impact on the game is somewhat diminished. This is the point where debate around this topic can come up. Sure, theoretically, effects that just win the game like Exodia are technically the most powerful effects in the game, but their actual impact on competitive play has been limited because Konami has purposefully limited these effects. For this list, we're looking at which effects have been, in practice, the most powerful. So the fact that unaffected monsters are rare and have only had brief stints of playability in the grand scheme of the game limits them against effects that are more common, but technically less powerful. Still, tons of decks have relied on big, unoutable towers to try and close games, and are a good representative for the most broken form of boss monster protection in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 9, we have setting cards from the deck. This is a bit of a strange effect, as in function, it's almost exactly the same as simply adding a card from your deck to your hand. This is only really used for spell and trap cards, not monster cards, for what should be obvious reasons. However, functionally, this is so similar to simply adding cards to your hand that they're both sort of in contention for this slot. Adding cards from the deck to the hand is powerful for a number of reasons, mainly because it allows you to find the card you need at any given point in time. A card like Sky Striker Mobilize Engage can be used to find a multitude of important pieces of interaction, flexing between whatever is most useful at any given time. Of course, finding cards that you can use as part of your combo is just as common, if not more common, than pivoting between particular cards. In fact, searching and activating several cards over the course of the turn is the way that most decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Function at this point. Setting cards directly from the deck or activating directly from the deck does the exact same thing with a couple of extremely notable upsides. Namely, it plays around cards like Ash Blossom and Joy Spring and Droll and Lockbird, two extremely powerful hand traps that can sometimes stop combos directly in their tracks. Now, often these cards will then add another card from your deck to your hand or special summon from the deck, which will be able to be affected by these hand traps. However, that's not to say that this doesn't get you value. For example, using an Emblema Oath to set up a stand-up Centaurion directly from the deck means that you have the ability to quick synchro whenever you special summon a monster, as long as you use a Centurion as material, which is key for how Centurion operates. Similarly, original Sinful Spoil Snake Eye has a graveyard effect that allows you to banish it to reset a monster and add a level 1 fire monster from deck to hand, giving you more extension on your next turn. Even if the effect gets negated, being able to get these cards into your rotation in the first place is still often a huge upside, making setting spell and trap cards directly from the deck far superior to simply adding them to your hand. We're combining adding cards from deck to hand and setting cards directly from the deck into one slot, as they're too similar to be two spots on this list. But they're both extremely powerful effects that are integral to how many strategies function. And at number 8, we have tributing your opponent's monsters. This is one of the most powerful forms of removal in Yu-Gi-Oh!, in part because it can get around the Tower's monsters we mentioned previously. The infamous Kaiju monsters have become staples of competitive play ever since their printing, thanks to their ability to answer essentially any type of monster in the game. This is because tributing the monster isn't an effect, but rather the condition of summoning the monster, so it's not considered an effect. While this doesn't come up in every format in practice, as a lot of decks are perfectly content to use other forms of removal. However, the existence of the Kaijus and their big brothers, Lava Golem and the Winged Dragon Raw Spear mode, play an important role in the game, as they prevent any board state from ever truly being unable to be interacted with. It doesn't matter how many unaffected by card effects monsters your opponent has, or how many Omni Negates they've summoned, you can always get around it by tributing their board away. The existence of these cards force combo decks to play smarter, to diversify the way they build their end boards away from simply putting up as many interactions as possible, and instead attempting to make their boards more resilient to more interaction. There's sort of a stopgap on how powerful the game can get, always giving players some way of breaking a board, no matter how powerful it may seem. Another important stopgap for the strength of the game is Nibiru the Primal Being, one of the most important hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! It has the effect where, if your opponent has summoned 5 times this turn, you can tribute all face-up monsters in the field, and if you do, summon it from your hand, and summon a token to your opponent's field with the combined stats of all monsters tributed this way. This was intended to stop combo decks from getting too out of hand, and while the power of the game has gotten to the point where a lot of decks can play through Nibiru, you still have to play around it. It's a bit strange that they decided that tributing your opponent's monsters specifically would be used on cards meant to keep the format in check, but these cards have had such a huge impact on the game that they single-handedly made tributing your opponent's monsters one of the most powerful effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 7, we have drawing cards. Taking the top card of your deck and adding it to your hand is good in every TCG, but it's maybe at its most broken form in Yu-Gi-Oh! Thanks to the fact that you can make immediate use of any cards you draw. Spell cards can be activated as soon as you draw them, and if they draw you more cards, you can use those cards as well. This means that if you play a card like Pot of Greed, you simply have more cards than your opponent has access to. If you have more cards than your opponent, you're able to trade every single one of your cards for one of your opponent's. The player who starts with the most cards will most likely win. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg in the modern game. You see, as time goes on, more and more decks have gotten to the point where one card can spiral off into an entire combo. This can create a bit of a snowball effect, where being up one card in your opponent can lead to being in a much better position than they are over the course of a couple of turns, as that card enables you to do a combo that gets you access to far more cards. As a result of just how broken these effects can be, they require massive downsides to balance them out, or else they'll end up taking an extended trip on the ban list. The pot cards are famous examples of these cards that have seen a ton of play throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, but all have something to stop you from just being able to activate a ton of them over the course of your turn, and end up with way more cards than your opponent. Avarice requires you to have 5 monster cards in your graveyard to shuffle back to activate it first, which leaves it vulnerable to hand traps interrupting your draw. More recently, pot cards like Extravagance require you to banish cards from your extra deck face down to activate it, and it can only be activated at the very start of your main phase 1, and prevents you from drawing cards with any other card effects for the rest of the turn. Despite these harsh conditions, these cards have had their fair share of time in the competitive limelight. Adjacent card drawing effects are cards like Pot of Duality and Pot of Prosperity, which allow you to excavate a number of cards from your deck and add any of those cards to your hand, each with their own downsides. These don't provide the same card advantage that normal card draws do, but the card selection they give you can often be more important. Considering the ability for decks to perform combos with a single card these days, finding the right card to start your combo, or make sure it goes through, can be just as important, leaving Prosperity with its relatively lax downsides as maybe the most popular pure draw spell in the game. This is only covering the cards that are only used to draw you cards as well. Cards like Time Thief or Doer can often allow you to draw cards of their effects, which is similarly powerful. The simple truth is that drawing extra cards is extremely powerful and often a game-winning effect. With all that said, why isn't the effect higher on the list? Well, because it's almost always so restrictive. The actual cards that allow you to draw cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are balanced around how ridiculously strong the effect is, and therefore often clash with what certain decks want to do. Considering how many cards there are that can search specific cards from the deck, you'll often get more card advantage through searching than drawing. Still, the ability to draw into non-engine and just generate card advantage makes any draw effect that you can put into your deck extremely valuable. And at number 6, we have special summoning from the deck. Special summoning has become a really important part of Yu-Gi-Oh! For some time now, and there are a lot of slightly different types of effects that could have been on this list. Cards that special summon themselves from the hand are extremely common and powerful, but the special summon effects that have repeatedly proven themselves to be problematic are special summoning from the deck or from the graveyard. Specialing from the deck is technically the most powerful, so it's getting that spot on this list. But honestly, it's somewhat interchangeable with which of these effects is more powerful at any given time throughout a game. So many cards have needed to be banned due to allowing you to special summon monsters from one of these two places too easily. Summon Sorceress, Fairy Tale Snow, Elder Entity Norden, Crystron Halki Fibrax, and more are all cards that are on or have been on the ban list thanks to special summoning themselves or other cards directly from the deck or just from the graveyard. And the problem here is really simple. There are just too many ways to turn summoning a monster into being able to add more cards from their deck to your hand, or summon even more monsters thanks to how many cards exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just look at Crystron Halki Fibrax for example. This allows you to special summon a level 3 or lower tuner from your hand or deck on Link Summon, but you can't activate its effects. However, there are a ton of level 3 or lower tuners that activate their effects somewhere besides the field, such as Jet Synchron or Spore, which can allow you to turn this Link 2 monster into 4 Link materials or several Synchro monsters, which made combos far too easy to do. The same thing applies to special summoning from the graveyard, as there are just too many cards that send cards from the deck to the graveyard. So the effect is similarly too easy to turn into a giant, long combo that ends with way too many points of interaction. This isn't even getting into how strong an effect that lets a monster special summon itself from the graveyard can be, as it can make actually getting rid of the threat for more than 5 seconds basically impossible. Fundamentally, the reason these effects are so much better than special summoning from your hand is that Konami has been a lot more strict on the ability to add cards from your deck to your hand than to send them to the graveyard. And summoning from the deck skips that step entirely. It just makes the entire process that much more efficient, and leads to things breaking. And at number 5, we have quick effect removal. Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game is all about monsters. They're the main way you get to a lot of your most important effects, and crucially, they're how almost every single deck wins the game. As a result, most games of Yu-Gi-Oh! Come down to fighting for control of the board, trying to summon monsters, and remove your opponent's monsters. With that in mind, it's probably no wonder that removal is an incredibly important part of the game. However, simple removal isn't enough, because decks are incredibly good at going for OTKs in the modern day. If they go uninterrupted, your opponent can almost certainly put 8,000 or more damage on board and win the game. So finding ways to stop your opponent from doing this is paramount. This is why almost every deck in the game will have at least one way to destroy an opponent's monster, or otherwise get them off the board during your opponent's turn. Otherwise, the decks would simply lose to your opponent's monsters during the battle phase. Now, quick effect removal isn't just good because it's a bit of a necessity these days, it can also be leveraged to amazing effect if used at the right time. By removing monsters that are needed to summon important monsters from the extra deck, you can stop them from summoning those boss monsters at all. A really simple example is that by removing their tuners before they can go for a summon, you can stop their synchros from ever coming out. This can lead to your removal effectively shutting down a massive amount of your opponent's turn if leveraged correctly. The combination of being pretty important to have access to and being extremely powerful when leveraged correctly easily earns quick effect removal a spot as one of the best effects in the game. And at number 4, we have sending cards from the deck to the graveyard. As we mentioned previously, sending cards from the deck to the grave is a lot easier than adding them to your hand, generally speaking. This is made extremely powerful, not only by copious cards that can special summon monsters from the graveyard, but also because there are a ton of cards that can activate from the graveyard. The ability to mill cards and then instantly get value has proven to literally be a game-breaking effect with cards like Tearlaments, which is still considered the most powerful deck the game has ever seen. A ton of versions of this effect have needed to be banned, including cards like Beatrice, Lady the Eternal, Chaos Ruler, the Chaotic Magical Dragon, and Curious, the Lightsworn Dominion that could mill cards from your deck as extra deck monsters, which all ended up being too strong for the game. Of course, they're only strong thanks to cards that can activate in the graveyard, of which will slowly occur more and more over time. One of the most important recent additions in this area is Transaction Rollback, which allows you to pay half your life points to apply the effect of any trap card in your graveyard without paying its costs. This could allow you to do broken stuff like destroy all of your opponent's cards with Elemental Burst without having to go through the ridiculous hoops of getting 4 monsters of the right attributes on board. You could argue that the cards that activate from the grave are more broken than the cards that put those cards into the graveyard, and it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. It's hard to tell which of these cards enables the other more, but whichever way you slice it, these cards have already proven themselves to be a consistent thorn in Konami's side. And at number 3, we have Lingering Floodgates. Floodgates are a series of cards that restrict your opponent from doing something or punish them for doing it. They're infamous in the community for both being extremely annoying and generally far too powerful. However, these floodgates can at least be destroyed by cards like Harpy's Feather Duster or Cosmic Cyclone. Their effects are static, only applying while they're face up on the field. But what if you can get all the same power of a floodgate, but without this vulnerability? Introducing the Lingering Floodgate, an effect that has been more and more controversial as the game has gone on. The poster child for this kind of effect is Max C, which allows you to send it from your hand to the graveyard to apply the effect where, for the rest of the turn, anytime your opponent special summons any monster, you draw a card. Max C is banned in the TCG and is a scourge on Master Duel and in the OCG, where it's one of the most heavily played cards in the game. If your opponent resolves a Max C, there's a good chance you've just lost the game, as you either have to skip your turn to deny them any draws, or give them draws and lose to the crackback as they have far too many cards for you to ever reasonably compete with. More recently, we got the Mulch Armies, which are restricted versions of Max C that are still some of the strongest cards in the format. They only trigger when your opponent special summons from particular zones, and they have multiple other restrictions as well. You can't control any cards to activate them, you have to shuffle back down to a certain number of cards during the end phase, and you can only activate 2 Mulch Army cards a turn, so you can't use all 3 in the same turn. These restrictions didn't stop them from being insane though. We could make this entire section just about the Mulch Armies and Max C, but there are a ton of other Lingering Floodgates we still haven't talked about yet. Artifact Scythe and Artifact Lancia are both Lingering Floodgates that have been extremely powerful in the past. Lancia is the more straightforward one, a hand trap that prevents either player from banishing cards for the turn. Scythe is way more annoying, but a little bit harder to use. Like all the artifacts, it can be set into your back row. If it's destroyed, you get to special summon it out during your opponent's turn, and when you do, your opponent can't special summon from the extra deck for the rest of that turn. There were tons of ways to get Scythe set and then pop it on the following turn immediately, and if this was resolved, it was basically game over. And we're still not done here when it comes to egregious Lingering Floodgates. Dimensional Barrier, Drone Lockbird, Outer Entity Azathoth, so many cards that have been banned or are suspect for bans due to stopping your opponent from playing with little to no recourse on their part. Floodgates are already extremely powerful, but removing one of the few ways of interacting with them that your opponent had makes them almost impossible to beat. This is supposed to be balanced out by only applying for a short amount of time. But with most Yu-Gi-Oh games only lasting 2 or 3 turns nowadays, they're basically just better floodgates at this point. Somehow, there are still effects that may be even more game warping than this. And at number 2, we have Effect Negation. There are a ton of ways to go about doing this effect, from only negating certain types of cards, to negating the activation of cards, to negating the effects of cards of a certain type. However it is they work, they're almost all extremely powerful. The most infamous type of negation has to be the end board Omni Negate, a big boss monster that can simply say no to anything your opponent tries to do. A ton of cards have been banned for doing exactly this. Appaloosa, Baron de Fleur, Borreload Savage Dragon being some of the more infamous examples thanks to being usable in so many decks before their bans. The problem with these cards was that, if you had enough material, you can often make a board with enough negates that your opponent couldn't realistically break your board no matter what 6 cards they drew. If you had an Appaloosa made with 3 or more materials and a Borreload Savage Dragon with a Link 3 monster equipped to it as a material, there's a real chance of having a negate for literally every card in your opponent's hand, preventing them from even being able to resolve a single card effect in the game. Now, the 6 negate board has happened in Yu-Gi-Oh! Before, but it's less common than people think. Often, you only get a couple of Omni Negates on your end board, even in a very combo-heavy format, even with the more generic boss monsters legal. The thing is, that's more than enough if your board has some layered interaction or a good amount of follow-up. Your opponent has to either use several cards like Evenly Matched to force you to waste your negates, or use several extenders to be able to perform their combo. And even if they do manage to out your board, they're probably not ending on their best board at that point. A few Omni Negates on an end board can almost guarantee that you're living until your next turn. However, this isn't even the end of the powerful effect negation. There's also a ton of hand traps that negate your opponent's card effects, such as Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring and Infinite Impermanence, and these are all integral to allowing decks to be able to compete on turn 2. This still isn't the end though, as you can also have cards like Called by the Grave and Crossout Designator, both of which are cards that are primarily used to negate your opponent's hand traps so that you can continue comboing. A big aspect that makes these effects so powerful is how they can be used to protect other broken cards. Cards like Rivalry of Warlords and Maxi are already backbreaking, but activating them with a negate up so your opponent can't stop them is essentially unbeatable. Any effect's power increases dramatically if it has a negate to back it up, and make sure it resolves or to stop your opponent from trying to stop you. This creates the need for more and more cards that either negate these negations, or cards that answer your opponent's entire board so they can't realistically ever let them resolve. Basically, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is kind of defined by effect negation. It's probably the most common and important way of interacting with your opponent, easily earning it a high spot on this list. But there's still one effect that's just so powerful that Konami essentially doesn't allow it to even exist in the game. And at number 1, we have discarding cards from your opponent's hand. This is an effect as powerful as it is uncommon. Back in the day, there were cards like the Forceful Sentry and Delinquent Duo, which were spell cards that would force your opponent to reveal their hand and allow you to shuffle a card back into their deck, or discard cards at random from their hand. These cards have been banned for a long time, thanks to allowing you to essentially rip apart your opponent's entire hand on turn 1 before they can even do anything. Now, a lot of these effects have old cards that have been banned for a while, and can never come back. The thing that makes discarding special is that Konami has basically never found a way to make a version of this effect that was okay. Almost every form of hand disruption that Konami has ever printed has gotten hit on the ban list. A good examination as to why is the most recent card that had to be banned for hand ripping potential, a Pointer of the Red Lotus. This is a trap card that requires you to pay 2,000 life points to activate, and simply allows you to look at your opponent's hand, choose a card, and banish it until the end of their next turn. The card is technically card disadvantage, and it's a trap card, one of the worst kinds of cards in the game as they're extremely slow with how fast the game is these days. Despite this, the card was banned because if you drew it on turn 1, it could be almost impossible for your opponent to come back. There are a couple of reasons for this, and in a Pointer's case, a big part of it is hand knowledge. Often, games of Yu-Gi-Oh! Come down to not resolving more cards than your opponent, but really just resolving the right card. If you can push through your starter, that can be enough to leave you in an advantageous position for the entire game. In order to accomplish this, players try to bait their opponent into wasting their interaction early to force through their starter. However, if you know your opponent's entire starting hand, they literally can't trick you into misplaying. This effectively removes one of the main ways of trying to counterplay your opponent's board. Even worse, this allows your opponent to get rid of an important card from your hand, usually a combo starter, so that you won't be able to perform your combo anyway. Even if you get the card back later, it won't matter at this point. This is one of the most nerfed versions of this effect, and considering that it was often the difference between winning and losing, you can imagine how powerful other cards of this effect have been. Even Triple Tactics Talent, which requires your opponent to activate a monster effect during your main phase for it to be able to be activated, has had to be limited thanks to how strong being able to rip a card out of your opponent's hand has been. Hand rips are at the perfect point of being an effect that Konami has printed somewhat consistently, despite the fact that they've basically never been okay, easily landing at the top spot of this list.